for us who should know more about our church, how it works, and what it is. So I appreciate your coming today.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and he very much downplayed his part in turning things around in Brockton. His leadership was unparalleled in anything I've experienced, and greatly appreciated that and admired it still. So I am going to just briefly go over the history of canon law, because I certainly didn't know it before I studied it, and it's quite disjointed, and it's kind of bizarre, as a matter of fact, how things came together. And then I'm going to talk about, in the current code of canon law, what areas of the daily life of the church, lay people, interface with canon law, and they probably don't even realize it most of the time. So, first I want to start off with the definition of law. I'm going to give you two. One from Thomas Aquinas. It says, thus from the four preceding articles, the definition of law may be gathered, and it is nothing else than an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by him who has care of the community and promulgated. And a more recent definition of law in one of our common dictionaries. Law is a system of rules which a particular country or community recognizes as regulating the actions of its members and which it may enforce by the imposition of penalties. So I think that gives you a flavor. As a community of the church, naturally we have laws that govern all aspects of it. So I'm going to start with the history from Professor Kenneth Pennington, who I actually had for canon law at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. There aren't very many history of canon law scholars in the world, but he's one of the most prominent. So if anybody ever wants to read more on this, just let me know and I can get the link to you. I mean, if you think about all the, I should mention this, you think about all the different places where we find law. You have in the Commonwealth, you have federal law, and then there's different levels of law. You have law, and then you have regulations. So you have federal code, and then there's federal regulations that tell you how to implement the law. So church law is very similar, and matter of fact, a lot of our common law and a lot of our statutory law here in the United States actually arose from principles from church law. The very first law of the church was actually from Scripture. And if you read some of the early Scripture carefully, you'll see that it's providing rules and ways that the community should act. So one of those was the Didache. I don't know if some of you may have heard of that. The Didache established rules for governing the liturgy, the sacraments, and lay practices such as fasting. Another example is the Pastoral Epistles, 1 Timothy and Titus, where the author tells Titus to appoint elders, which we would now call presbyters, priests, and bishops in each city to govern the community. Elders should be married only once, their children should be Christians, and they should not live in luxury or sin. So the early Christians didn't know where to look, so they found it in Scripture and from the leaders of the church at the time. The very first kind of formal church law came from ecclesiastical councils. And so throughout Christendom, you had bishops, and when things started coming up in the communities, they had councils to discuss areas of ambiguity, areas of problems, and that started as early as the 3rd century. The first significant council was held in 314 at a place in the Galatian city of Ankara. And the council issued 25 canons, and I probably should mention what a canon is. It's just a principle of law. So the code of canon law that we'll get to in a bit has 1,715 canons, and some of them have subdivisions, whatever, but they're principles of law that are established by the lawmaker. In this case, the lawmaker was the council. So 25 canons dealt with the discipline of the clergy, alienation of church property, chastity, adultery, murder, and magic. So you'll see some themes that are very common throughout the history, the 2,000-year history of the church. Of course, we all heard of the Council of Nicaea, and that's where we got the Nicene Creed. This is the first time in the year 325 that norms became established for the whole universal church.
Yeah, not as much. Just a little louder, that's all we need.
Okay.
Sorry about that. But, adjustment, I'm sorry to interrupt. Just give it a shot.
How's that?
Sorry, don't sue me. No. Okay.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay,
Thank you.
so in the Council of Nicaea, certain episcopal sees, certain areas with the church were given primacy over others. And the first three that have received primacy were Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria. Nicaea also created rules for naming bishops. The idea of the metropolitan for a province was created, and if anybody wants to learn more about that, I can explain if they don't know. And of course, the Nicene Creed. And just an example of how canon law pervades our everyday life that we don't even think about. We say the Creed every Sunday. The Creed is an example of divinely revealed, infallible teaching. So there's not too many things that you could say that equals that. And my professor that I had for, we call the teaching authority of the church, said, these are the types of things in the Creed that maybe you should be martyred for. So that kind of imprinted the importance of what we believe is when we say the Creed. Also, in the 4th century, also the first papal decretal was issued, and this was going now we're going for another 8 centuries, but become very important in the 13th century, and I'll get to that. Papal decretal is basically someone asks a question of the Pope, and the Pope responds after he talks to his advisors what he thinks the rules should be in a certain case. And so then people would take that and say, okay, let's put this somewhere. And it would become a source of law later on. And they would start to compile these papal decretals. They'd say, okay, he said this in this situation, this in this situation. And so these were principles of law that came from the letters of the Pope. So the first papal decretal talked about validity of baptisms performed by heretics, rules for bestowing baptism, the treatment of Christians who lapsed into paganism. And one of the hallmarks of the papal decretals will be the fact that the Pope consults with his advisors. And so the refrain of every response would end with, or begin with the advice of our brothers who are led to respond. So the Pope's not acting alone, he's acting with advisors. These letters would then be dispersed, and then, like I said, made into collections. So, a very significant event in the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian ordered that 16 of his legal advisors compile all the areas of law, mostly Roman law, going back to the Roman Empire from the 1st century to the 3rd century, all the famous jurists, and he wanted to come up with one place where all this law was set forth. Problem was, he said, there can be no gloss on the law. You can't comment on it. You have to just take it as it is. And any lawyer knows that law without commentary or dicta or figure out what it means just goes nowhere. So it basically died on the vine right there. But we'll see it revived shortly. Just a little note about how pervasive the compiling of canons was. In the 8th century, in 700 AD, Irish missionaries brought a collection of canons to the continental Europe, and we still have 80 copies, some excerpts, and some are full. So I think that's shows you how widespread by the 18th century compilations of laws were. And in the 9th century, we see Roman law creeping in more and more into the compilations of canon law. And at this time, the East and the West were largely using the same sources of laws, but in the East, decretal letters were never authoritative. And you'll see that became a source of contention in the church. There's still no real notion of centralized authority to issue or be responsible law. It's all kind of happening haphazard. In the 11th century, in addition to the schism, we also see growing emphasis on papal, judicial, and legislative authority in the West. So in the 12th century, in the second half of the 12th century, we saw the rise of the university, especially at first in Bologna, and they rediscovered that Justinian's Codex from the 16th century, or from the 6th century, and they started now commenting on it, and they started saying, what does this mean? And so you started having the rise of jurists, and basically it's the first sign of a system of law that you see throughout the world, not just in canon law. And on the canon law side of things, there was a monk whose name is Gratian, and he's considered the father of canon law. And he wrote this thing called the Decretal. And so he took all these collections of laws, and he brought them all together into one, and then he started to try to figure out how do you reconcile the different laws. If, say you had a council over here, it's contradictory to a council over here. And so he basically tried to do that. And he also commented on the ones that he thought were abrogated or defunct and no longer in effect. But this became revolutionary in the field of canon law, and you had all these people sending their experts over to study to Bologna, and then eventually Paris to study canon law. And so the thing at the time was to study Roman law and canon law kind of side by side. Those are you really couldn't do one without the other. They kind of inform each other. So the papal decretals that I mentioned earlier that started in the 4th century become very large idea in the 12th century. Earliest jurist, the guy who basically compiled but then commented on it, was Bernard of Pavia. He studied Gratian's Decretum and later became Bishop of Pavia, and he divided his compilation into 5 books: Judge, Court, Clergy, Marriage, and Crime. So in addition to having a system of law for Roman law, we now have a system of law for church law. And these papal decretals, you now had greater experts in the law who were advising the Pope, giving him advice, and basically they were the ones answering on behalf of the Pope. And that basically went from the late 12th century to the early 14th century. And in the early 14th century was the creation of the Roman Rota, which is a court that still exists in Rome. And now it just deals mostly with the nobles. But just taking the decision-making and law-making from the hands of the Pope and putting it in the hands of judges, and basically the beginning of common law, and we say the case law here in the United States is very much based on this idea. So over the course of the next few hundred years, we have more compiling of canons and data, and more expertise and jurists who are commenting on that. So it's I'd say from 1500 to the present day, well, until the 1900s. A lot of the things that we take for granted in our legal system came into being in church law. So human rights, due process, the concept of innocent until proven guilty, the ideas of equity and justice, defendant's right to a trial, defendant had the right to be cited and be present at his trial. Those things were not a given before, say, the 18th century, 17th century. So then in 1903, we have the first ever official church law. And given the fact that Europe was based on a code system, and the only place here we have in the United States is New Orleans, Louisiana. Everybody else has statutory law and common law. So they chose it based on the fact that Napoleon introduced the code, back when he was in charge, and it just took off throughout Europe. So Pope Benedict XV promulgated the 1917 code, and that was in effect until Vatican II. And during Vatican II, Pope John called for the revision of the code, and that's the code we have now, the 1983 code. So unless there's questions on the history, I'm going to switch over to common areas where canon law affects your life. And when I'm done with this, if there's certain topics you want to hear more about, I'm happy to do that, or if there's questions.
Anyone regarding the development of the code or whatever, how we got there right now? Well, Mark will, if not, then we'll just come right into the second part, which is how our life is affected by that. What is it in the church rules that actually covers it? And you'll see that the interface is quite large, and in effect, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about that in that area more so. Yeah.
Common law evolves from a series of judicial decisions. One decision modifies a decision that was issued maybe 100 years earlier by a different body. Since canon law is universal, how is that implemented? Say the law in Argentina is a lot different than the law in the United States. How do you reconcile, how do you get uniformity, and how do you how do you develop new precepts, and how are the precepts, the precedents evaluated?
So that's a very good question. So when you have a code system, there really is no precedent. You have a principle of law that you use, you look at it fresh every time you deal with a question. And as a result, you have so many different interpretations of that. And it's as if someone who's trained initially as a civil lawyer, it's difficult for me to sometimes deal with the fact that, okay, this Pope said this at one point, why isn't it then binding on the rest of us? But it's not. It's so the apostolic signatory is the highest court in the church over in Rome, and what they say in certain cases can be instructive for how you interpret it. There's no binding effect to our canons.
Is there a system that's equivalent to, let's say, what we know? You have district courts, you have superior courts, you have state courts, and you wind up with the Supreme Court at the end of it. Is there a system similar to that? That, for example, you work in the Archdiocese of Boston as a canonist, and certain things come up. Is there a judging system in Boston as well, that then moves up through various levels and gets to some final decision-making at that? Is there some sort of a system in it?
Okay, another good question. There is there's a Boston Tribunal. It's called the Metropolitan Tribunal because Boston is the metropolitan see for the province. The province consists of the 4 dioceses of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. So it's a Metropolitan Tribunal, and so each diocese has their own tribunal, but they don't hear cases the way civil cases are heard. So they deal with questions of nullity of marriage, and they deal with penal law when there's a trial, when you actually have a trial. But someone can't sue the same way you can in civil courts. What we have is what we call hierarchical recourse. And so to the extent that you feel aggrieved by something that the bishop's done or a pastor has done, you have the right to take recourse. First, say a pastor has done something that you feel has violated your rights, per se. You first bring that to the bishop and ask him to change the mind, to overturn the decision of the pastor. And then if you don't like that decision, they can appeal to one of the congregations in Rome. And should you not like that decision, you can still appeal to the Apostolic Signature, which is the highest court. And then there's regular court, that's a signature, and then there's the full college of cardinals who would then hear cases as well. So it's a very different system than the U.S. civil law.
Have you been personally involved in any situation and actually gone that route, the entire route?
So the parish closings in 2004 were many parishes appealed, and it took years for it to go through all the way. And they took as far as they can go. Some stopped after the congregation or clergy denied them. Others brought it to the very end when the parish closed, and the final hearings on those cases were in 2008. And then when the diocese, the bishop decided to close some churches, then they appealed that decision. And then those went to 2011. So they were in Rome for a long time.
But that doesn't require for the local individuals, for example, such as yourself, to represent any piece of that along the way, is there?
So you need, you don't need to hire a canon lawyer when you're appealing to the congregation of clergy. You do need to hire an approved canon lawyer who knows Latin when you're appealing to the signature. And there's not many approved canon lawyers, so you're given a list of like 10. And then it's based on what language you speak. So it's very different. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. But that's one of the things where, one of the things I was going to get to anyway is, as members of the lay faithful, you have a right to recourse and to have your decision, your day heard by the experts over in Rome. But there's a whole section in canon law called the obligation and rights of the Christian faithful. So you have obligations to remain in communion with the church. You have an obligation to raise your children in the faith. You have an obligation to see that social justice clauses are met. But then you also have rights. You have the right to make your opinion known to your pastor. Your right to make your needs known as well. And the pastor has an obligation to make those things, the sacraments of the church available to you. You have a right to the sacraments. One of the canons which says that as long as you are sufficiently prepared and you request at a timely manner, that you can't be denied the sacraments. And we deal with the diocese all the time where pastors tell somebody, say parents of an 11-year-old say, I want my son to be confirmed. And the pastor says, well, you have to wait until high school when everybody else gets confirmed. And, then the parents eventually call the diocese saying, the pastor is refusing me my son's confirmation. And we tell the pastor, they have a right to appeal to Rome, and Rome is going to side in their favor. There's no reason to deny someone the sacrament when they're ready and they're asking for it. You have a right to worship. There's a bunch of. So if you're interested, it's Canons 208 to 223. Some of you may be members of your parish councils. Every parish has at least a finance council, and then the bishop determines whether the parish is also going to have a pastoral council. And so that's how he includes the people of the parish. In Boston anyway, that's 50% of the council has to be representative. It has to come from the congregation. They can vote it in, and then he can appoint 50% of the parish council. He appoints all the members of the finance council. And the same structure exists at the diocese level. There's a pastoral council that has about 30 members, and there's a finance council that has about 12. And the church has this structure that we're always looking for. While the priests and the bishops are the ones running the show, they need to be informed of things they don't know about. So they need expertise, and that's why they have these councils. And the more successful pastors will actually listen to the advice of the experts in law, in finance, marketing, communication, all those things. So in addition to councils, there are such a things, and there's a right in canon law to associate. So So if you have something that you want to gather with other Christians about, you have that right in canon law. Called associations of the faithful, and they can either be private or public. Private act in their own name, and you can create your own statutes, and you operate according to statutes. And if you want to be recognized by the church will review your statutes. And then a public association of the faithful acts in the name of the church, and the bishop has more control over it, and he appoints leadership and things like that. In Boston, the only public associations of the faithful that I know about are budding religious orders. So when you first start as a religious order, you start out as a private association of the faithful, and then when you start growing, you're made a public association of the faithful, and then if you get 40 members and vows, you can apply to be an institute of religious life on a diocesan level. And then if you get 150, you can become an institute on a universal level. It's called pontifical. But some examples of a private association would be St. Vincent de Paul Society. I blank, but there's tons of others that exist in the church, and even in, we have a Spanish-speaking communities in Boston. There's probably 10 different associations of the faithful, all dealing with different charisms and different emphases. One is called Emmaus. I'm trying to think of some others. Hijos de Santa Maria. Okay, the other aspect that we touched upon is the sacraments. So, even early in the church, they were dealing with what's a valid baptism, what's an invalid baptism. So it's a very common question, and there's rules that say, how do you get to a valid baptism? And for baptism, it's you either pour water over whoever's head, and you invoke the Trinity. So I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Amen. I don't know if you saw in the news, probably a few months ago, there's somewhere in the Midwest, a priest had been ordained, but he was invalidly baptized. If you're invalidly baptized, that invalidates every sacrament thereafter. So his ordination was invalid. Doesn't bring peace to people who had sacraments from him. But those things are for validity of a sacrament are right in the Code of Canon Law. So take for example, for priesthood, it's the laying on of hands of a bishop, and then Pope Paul VI added for validity the consecratory prayer. So one of those two things is missing, you don't have a valid priesthood. So.
Can you elaborate on that just for a moment? If his acts were invalid all the way along, you just mentioned sort of in blank saying, well, that's kind of tough for the people that were in there. What about those cases and kind of events, life events that they were involved in, that became either invalidated, whether there were marriages, whether there were some other kind of other baptisms, for example?
Luckily, he was a fairly newly ordained priest, and it was, I think, pretty simple to rebaptize. Baptism doesn't need to be from a priest, so those were fine.
Right.
The marriages, you can sanate a marriage, so you can go back and heal it at its roots, is what they call it. So you wouldn't have to say that the last 5 years, 2 years that you were married didn't count. You go back to the root. And frankly, you could do it without even letting the couple know. It's sanatio and radice is what it says. It's called in Latin. So you have annulments, but then there's also times where you're healing. Say there's some defect in your consent, even if the priest was validly ordained, and the priest left something important out, accidentally or whatever. One party of that marriage can appeal to have that sanated from the beginning, even if the other party doesn't even know. It's just so the church recognizes that marriage now.
I'm interested in an intersection between canon law and civil law. It's pretty simple. Marriages are reconciled by, are accepted by the civil authorities. If I have a marriage certificate in the church, that's valid in civil cases, in civil cases and legal system. I'm curious about divorces. I mean, there's a whole retinue of lawyers that make a living in divorce cases, and the divorce cases are acrimonious and usually involve a judge. What is the legal aspects involved in dissolving a marriage? Is it as simple as saying, as going to the priest and saying, well, it's not working out for us, and you give me a certificate of divorce, or is there a more rigorous, complicated, complex procedure to get a divorce in Catholic law?
Yeah, so there is we don't use it here in the United States, but there is something in canon law called the decree of separation, where you basically say, we're still married, but we're separating. So, you know, once people pass consent, once you give your consent, we believe that divine law makes that marriage. So we also have what we call canonical form of marriage. So if two Catholics get married outside of the church, we don't consider that a marriage, because they're bound to canonical form, which is before a witness of the church, usually a priest or a deacon, and with two witnesses. So lacking that, you would just need to do what we call a lack of form case. If one of those two people who didn't get married in the church, one of those two Catholics, they wanted to get married in the church later, they would go to their pastor would fill out what we call a lack of form case, and it's just a documentary case to prove that their marriage is not recognized. Now, if it's two Protestants, we said they're bound to whatever form that they're bound to, and most Protestants don't have any form requirement. You can get married by a justice of the peace, and it's recognized. So there's a lot of confusion over that. We say, oh, we don't recognize their marriage because they're Protestants, and it's not true. Divine law says that consent makes marriage. So you would need, if the Protestant then divorces and wants to marry a Catholic, you would need a formal annulment, and that goes through the tribunal, and it's a pretty involved case, and usually takes between 9 and 12 months. Witnesses, mostly documentary, but they get testimony from the person who's seeking. They allow the ex-spouse to be involved in the process, and they're allowed witnesses. And then once you have an annulment, basically the annulment is looking at the time of consent. Was something lacking in your consent? And the most common form in the United States is basically gross immaturity. But there's other things too. You can marry somebody and they withheld secret from you about who they really were, and then you'd say that's a ground for an annulment. Or if they never had any notion of being faithful in the marriage, and they were cheating on you before you got married, and cheating on you after you got married, you can say that they withheld a certain part of that intent to be with that person singly, for them, that one person for the rest of their lives. So I think we do about 200 annulments a year. We used to do a lot more back in the 80s and 90s. But that's.
Is there a lawyer involved in the annulment procedures, or do you have an advocate that researches the evidence and takes testimony? What is the physical performance in an annulment? Is there a seated judge there?
Yep.
Are there advocates?
I see your wife getting anxious around those questions.
So there is. They don't have to hire anybody. The tribunal has what they call a petitioner advocate and a respondent advocate. The petitioner is the one who files for the annulment, and the respondent advocate is the person who would represent the ex-spouse. And then there's canon law allows for, there's another intersection of lay people, allows for lay judges, but they can only serve as a judge in a panel with two other priests. And the priest judge can serve alone. And then the judge evaluates the evidence, will seek more evidence if he needs it, evaluates the testimony of the witnesses. It's usually people who knew the couple or knew the petitioner very closely.
Is there any reason why a sister can't sit on the tribunal?
Oh, the sister can. We have Sister Peggy Sullivan, and we did have Sister Mary Lou Walsh, who is retired now in Boston.
Do you have their phone numbers? I have a question about penalties associated with the canon.
No, I have not heard, okay? Just let's see if we can make your question known from the very beginning.
Okay.
Thank you.
So my question concerns penalties imposed by canon law and the mechanism for imposition. Can, for example, confessor priests in reconciliation impose certain penalties? And beyond the, say, female marriages and our fathers?
That's a good question. A confessor cannot impose a penalty, but sometimes a person's actions will impose penalties by the very fact of them doing it. And primary example is murder or abortion. You're automatically excommunicated. But a confessor, in Boston at least, I think the Pope actually gave every priest this faculty. It used to be that when someone confessed abortion, you couldn't forgive the sin until you had remitted the penalty, the censure is what it's called, the excommunication. So you'd have to go, that priest would have to go get permission and then say, come back to see me. So now the Pope Francis and Cardinal Sean had done this years ago. They give the faculty to the priest to remit the censure. So the priest who hears someone's been, committed abortion, was involved in abortion, he can remit that penalty and then forgive them right on the spot. But a confessor cannot impose penalties. So sometimes you can impose them on yourself, but not that way.
By faculty, what he means is the power and the rights to do that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the giving over the power to do a certain thing. So I kind of act as a go-between for the cardinal when someone wants, a priest asks for the faculty to confirm somebody, they go through me and I get the cardinal's signature. And so the priest can't do that on his own, only the bishop can.
Ingrid, I think, has
As regards the Canon politics. For example, if a Catholic politician is banned, so to speak, or is not allowed to have communion, what happens? They do, like Mr. Biden was born by the
Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation going around on denying communion to pro-choice politicians. There's two canons that talk about communion and receiving it in a worthy state. And the first one is Canon 9:15. And I think I might be getting that mixed up. One is basically saying if you're in a state of sin, you shouldn't approach communion. That's leaving it up to the individual. The second one is when pastors can deny communion. And you can't just deny communion. You first have to warn them that they're in a state of sin. And holding a belief, I'd like to hear from the moral theologian, is whether that's being in a state of sin. The canon originally was meant for prostitutes, and back in the day when actors were kind of seedy people, those are the two classes of people that canon was meant for. So I'm hoping that this new document that USCCB, the bishops of the United States, are going to put out is going to be helpful for explaining, these differences and these nuances. But you first have to warn the person that they're in a state of sin, and then they'd have to continue to be obstinate about not complying before you deny communion.
just a clarification in terms of informing them of that. Is that public or is that private?
I would hope private.
I would hope so. Is somebody else in there? We don't want to drive your total presentation, but
honestly,
on the other hand, if there was a plan in terms of what you needed to show that you covered, I'd like to make sure that, in essence, that you get to that point. No. Is there a way that you would like to develop it other than?
No, if anybody wants to hear more on a certain topic, say governance in the church, structure of diocese, or anything like that, or any kind of question, sacramental questions.
Okay. We're opening up now for a specific question, right? So loud.
We're going to have to hire a lawyer.
This is about closing churches. And it's something that's, I'm going to say it's mild, but we know that during the COVID time period, no one went to church. Most people. You went to Zoom sessions. And a Zoom session was where you saw a priest basically perform the Mass, celebrate the Mass at his own, some location, and where all of us zoomed in. But maintaining, one of the reasons why churches are closed is because it costs a lot to maintain all the infrastructure. Even though the community still exists, the cost benefit isn't there, so we close it. So the thought comes, well, what if you didn't need all the cement and the lighting and everything that makes it impossible? Is there something in canon law that prevents it? I'll give you a specific structure because this kind of evolved in a discussion recently we had. Picture this. We have a location, just like this hall right here. The priest is sitting in a parish in Boston. There's a little camera like this one facing this audience. The priest looks out. He can look out through his Zoom to see the audience here. And we have this big 9 by 12-foot screen, and we see him as well. So now there's a community, there's a priest being conveyed, and let's say we want to celebrate a Mass. This is already past COVID time. We have the Mass celebration. We have readings. We can have the readings here. And when it comes to the Eucharist, we have an agreement with a very nearby local parish church and Eucharistic ministers who deliver the communion to the gathering in a location that we have chosen. Could that be considered as a celebration of a Mass within the canon law?
So honestly, I don't think so. We have all of our sacraments have to be in person. So I mean, there are times we stretch it and say you have an overflowing church and then you send people downstairs, but you're still in the same building. Take for example, during COVID, the question came up about anointing of the sick, and could you do that over the phone or through a Zoom? And the answer from Candace and myself would be no. It's got to be in person. So we had teams that we had put on all the protective gear, and we came up with the safest way to do that, and we had them anoint person's feet with like a cup swab. So it was like an extension of the hand. So you can stretch things a little bit, but I think that's stretching it too far. You have a Sunday obligation, and I don't think that would meet your Sunday obligation.
So is it, if I can follow that through, so you consciously use the words, I don't think so. Is that something that is a bishop's decision?
So that would be, a question for, eventually for the Holy See, if other people started, coming into, say you had canon lawyers disagreeing. I mean, if someone asked my opinion, I'd say no. But I'm just a canon lawyer who gives advice to the bishop. I don't have any authority to determine yes or no. I just interpret the law. So we have some questions now about this new document that came out on the Latin Mass. And the question is, can the bishop dispense from, I don't know if you all know about this document that just came out. The Pope is restricting the use of what we used to call the extraordinary form, and he's also getting rid of that word. He's basically saying it's up to the bishops to determine the usage of it, and maybe keeping the way it is, but to the extent that a newly ordained priest wants to celebrate the extraordinary, the old Latin Mass, the 1962 Missal, they now need the permission of the Holy See. So one of the things in that document says you can't have the extraordinary form, the traditional Mass, the 62 Missal Mass, in a parochial church, which means a parish church. So you can have it at a shrine, you can have it at a chapel, but you can't have it at a parochial church. And so the question is, can the bishop dispense from that provision? And you have canon lawyers saying, yes, he can. And you have other canon lawyers saying, no, it's an essential element of the document in the law that he can't. I tend to think that he can, but because there's a disagreement, we think we may need to ask the Holy See what they think.
But while that disagreement is being adjudicated, you're saying yes, and the cardinal saying yes to be permitted until judged inappropriate.
Correct.
Can you wait just a moment for this question?
My question would be, how does canon law get changed? I mean, is it like you know, you need 2/3 of all the canon lawyers in the world to make an amendment, or, I mean, how does a law get changed if you see the need to?
So, good question. So, for the Universal Church, the only lawmaker is the Pope, or the Pope in conjunction with the bishops, the Universal bishops. So, take for example, the Vatican II. So, the bishops came up with the law, and then the Pope kind of basically approved it, signed off on it. You needed both. But the only a bishop can legislate for his diocese, but it can't be for anybody beyond that diocese. So we have what's called particular law. So the bishop can change the law that he promulgated. He can't change universal law, and the Pope can change universal law. And he just did recently. We have the Code of Canon Law is divided into 7 books, and book 6, I believe, is on penalties. And so he completely revised the law on penalties. So even though I have the old, there's a brand new law that goes into effect this October, and we'll see, you know, what the commentators say about that and all that. But only the Pope can change universal law.
I would like to change the questions about dealing with end of life. This question that I want to ask you sort of was generated by a lady, which I met in a cocktail party, and she kind of came up to me and really nailed me with a question saying that, Sigurd, am I going to see my husband again? You know, it's something that kind of floors you. So I said, well, you know, it's better to think that way now than otherwise, you know, it's a Pascal's, I guess, wager, you know, you weigh nothing if you say no. And, you know, the poverty of that answer bothered me for quite a long time. And I sort of like decided, you know, to hit the internet and see what I could find out about that question. Well, I found some stuff that was issued by a congregation for the doctrine of the faith about 42 years ago. It's a letter containing questions concerning eschatology. Could you question it a little bit closer? It was a letter, in other words, on certain questions concerning the eschatology. The letter makes it very plain that as they call it, the spiritual element, which represents the human self, survives in death. And in other words, and it's a statement, you know, it's a how should you say, doctrinal matter. That is fine. However, during that time of 40 or so years, the neurosciences grew up, and that kind of creates sort of a problem. The concept of soul to the scientists became consciousness. Plainly put, consciousness is all the experiences that you accumulated in your life. And you would say, well, that is equivalent to the soul. But not quite. The problem is this, that as the person gets older, the neural, let's say, apparatus in his brain deteriorates, and his consciousness fades out, gets washed out. So here it is, the soul, as the congregation of let's say faith says, survives, and the consciousness is gone. It's sort of like it's a problem that needs how should I say, something to be reconciling.
Unfortunately,
question, sir, is there how should I say somebody that studies this in Catholic Church, and is there a theology for dementia?
That's an interesting question. We have different areas in the church that would probably tackle that question. Gratefully, it's not a question for the canon lawyers. They have experts, so in doctrine, they have experts in bioethics, and we have some really talented people. There's a Father Tag down at the Diocese of Fall River, Massachusetts, who is bioethics, moral theologian. So I don't know if anybody's tackling that question, but it would be up to those people to address that.
It gets into the area of philosophy and others as well, so it's not just clearly a question of law, I think. Dr. Baikus is giving a presentation tomorrow on end-of-life issues, what comes up, how to handle them, and he's an ethicist by virtue of having served on a hospital committee for ethics for a considerable period of time, a decade or more. And he had his hands up, and I wonder what he has to say about this topic, as long as we can keep it within reason. Could you mind clarifying what you had in mind?
2 sentences to answer that question.
2 sentences to answer that question. We have done extensive research into the literature and empirical evidence about near-death experiences. And that's a fascinating topic. We have empirical evidence that's measurable where people say, what happens? Will I see my sister again? Will I see my loved one again? And we can talk about that empirically, in not just philosophically or spiritually. And we will cover some of that tomorrow.
As a practicing physician that has certainly some merit, and we'll hear more about that tomorrow then. Good. If we have anyone else for the time being, we can get into double or triple questions from the audience, but if there's anyone else that still has something they would like to bring up, either on that or another issue, and then we'll get to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I have just a very mundane question. I know from your biography that you are also a civil lawyer. Is that a requirement to become a canon lawyer?
No. Yeah, we have plenty of canon lawyers who are not civil lawyers. My provincial, when I first joined, because I had a civil law degree, he asked me if I'd consider it canon law. And I said, sure, not knowing anything what that meant. And I had a couple years of formation that were kind of loose on terms of, you know, on what church teaching was and things like that. And so I kind of had a journey back to kind of where is the church on these questions. And then the next provincial asked me to study canon law, and I went, and I haven't regretted it. It has helped me talk to the civil lawyers. So I work closely with our general counsel and the attorneys who represent us in the archdiocese. And because I know the concept in civil law and I know the concept in canon law, sometimes they just have different names. So take, for example, adverse possession of property is called prescription in canon law. So it helped me, it has helped me interface with the civil lawyers.
Marcus, Victor, just let me get to you in a moment. If you want to start saying it loud, we'll finish when we get there. Okay.
So the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, Theodore McCarthy, was defrocked for his sexual misdeeds. And recently I read that he's now been indicted in Boston on a criminal charge. So that made me think back to the news that he had been defrocked. And I don't remember, you know, was there a trial? Who made the decision? Could you just outline a little bit what happens in those cases?
Sure.
And what are the criteria for deciding what's so serious that a priest can be defrauded?
So his case was a little different because he's a bishop. But priests, we have a whole, even new procedure when a priest is accused. So if there's the word in canon law, it's kind of if the accusation at least seems true, then you have to do a preliminary investigation, and that happens at the local level. We have a delegate for investigations who is a former police officer, and the one who heads it all up is a former assistant DA, and so those two do their thing, and I do the canon law things with the decrees for the preliminary investigation. So then the investigation is done, and then you bring it to the new creation. It's not in the Code of Canon Law, but it's now in some of the new documents from the Holy See. You bring it to the review board, and that is mostly lay people, expertise in psychology, crime, nursing, doctors, all that. And we had a judge on there for a while. If they decide, they make a recommendation to the cardinal, to whether they think there's probable cause to have a trial. And again, it's words aren't probable cause, but it's similar to what a grand jury would be doing. And then the Archbishop's decision to make it say, am I going to write to Rome, asking for some guidance as to whether it should be an administrative process or a full-blown trial. If there's a lot of evidence and it's clearer that this guy may have done this, you would do an administrative process, and the bishop would appoint two assessors who would give their opinion in writing to the bishop, and then he basically, but you need that permission from your congregation of the doctrine of the faith. Congregation of the doctrine of the faith may say there's not enough evidence to do administrative process, you're going to hold a trial. Sometimes there's reasons why the trial's held elsewhere at different dioceses. Unfortunately, there's not too many people who know how to run a trial because it's ancient. The code of canon law on trials goes back to Roman Empire times. So when the new code of penal law came out, I was very upset. I'm like, this isn't what we need. We need a new code on trials, a new book on trials. For Bishop McCarrick, I think it started at the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith and it ended at the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. So they held a trial on their own, and he had an advocate, and there's a promoter of justice who's basically the prosecutor. So there are some similarities, but it's mostly a documentary case. They don't really have like a trial where you have witnesses, things like that. You may have the judges would interview witnesses, but it wouldn't be in public. It would be, closed behind closed doors.
So the canon law authorities share their findings with civil authorities, or there's a wall?
So what we do in Boston, and I think most places do that, we don't act until civil authorities have done their case. So if the case is outstanding with an attorney general or assistant DA or DA, and they're investigating and they haven't made a determination whether they're going to prosecute or not, we don't do anything until they make that determination. And if they do decide to prosecute, we don't do anything until the case is decided. And if there are some intricacies in the canon law that say if you've admitted in civil court that you've done this, the bishop can move for an ex officio dismissal from the Pope, so you don't have to go through the whole process of the trial. There's someone in the back there.
Okay, all right, anything left to him?
No.
Wait a minute. Oh, sorry about that. I didn't realize that. I didn't see you back there.
First of all, full disclosure, I'm Father John. I am an OFM, and I am the Cardinal General of the Order. So full disclosure. The whole clergy sex abuse issue has taught dioceses, mostly in the United States, less so in other parts of the world, and also religious communities, how to make information available about process. You go to a website, and there's a whole section on almost every diocesan website. But that doesn't affect most of the parishioners. So parishioners sometimes have a question about, is their pastor doing things correctly? For example, because I get calls from some of these people here about finance committees and parish councils, and how do parishioners find a way to get answers to questions like that aren't on the website? And you get the call 1-800, call the diocese, and you get somebody at the front desk who takes a message, and maybe you'll get something back to you. And this is something that I've been talking to dioceses in different places and saying, you need to develop your website for the majority of your parishioners to have access to people in the diocese or archdiocese. So from your experience in Boston, I have an issue with my pastor. Who do I call? Besides my neighbor, we'll call another neighbor, and we'll create a whole story, and the whole church is falling down. And meantime, the question was simple. It could be answered. How do we make those connections?
That's a very good question, and I don't know that we do a very good job, even in Boston, of making it clear.
I look on your website, you don't.
But we do get a lot of emails through what we call the webmaster, and then they get forwarded hopefully to the right department. So I get emails with questions about canon law sometimes, and sometimes people know to call the diocese, and they have enough experience at the front desk to say, okay, that question's handled by Brother Jim. But yeah, I think we probably could do a better job on that. But I feel a lot of questions from the parishes. So sometimes if somebody doesn't like the answer they got from their pastor, they'll come and they'll know to call either me or also clergy personnel to complain. And sometimes we can help them, and sometimes we can't. There are times where I try to give people avenues. Take for example, you'd be surprised how often this comes up. Someone says, I want to replace the godparent of my son or daughter. And so you ask why, and you go through the whole thing. And they say, well, you can't erase a fact that happened. But there is a document that came from the Holy See in the 90s, from the Congregation of Doctrine of Faith, that says the parent can replace them, and you don't take it out of you put it in annotations in the registry, so the person feels that they've been heard and doesn't feel that this person who they now hate is the godparent of their child.
Now, just to follow up on Father John's question, all right, forget about the complaint, let's say how to handle it, but in a situation, if there's an admission on your part, on behalf of the Archdiocese, that the website doesn't cut it in terms of that kind of information, what would be the next step? Or in other words, how would you go about fixing that? Or how should the Archdiocese go about fixing that? And who's responsible for it?
That's a good question. So we have people who are in charge of our webpage, but someone would have to prompt them to do it, and then they'd be probably, I can't get to it for the next 2 years. So I can certainly pursue it. I don't know how much.
Well, the best thing is the church still form a commission. That's the
Yes, I've been on a lot of those.
All right. ¿Darío Pascual más?
Yeah.
It is, huh?
If I could just address my earlier question from a somewhat different angle, more a generic understanding. So again, we have the church, property, and mass. How does, and maybe the distinction between mission and church. Is there any, if the alternative is either you are financially capable of preserving an impossible structure for a small community, is it disband, or is there some other means other than, to help the church make a positive decision to maintain maybe a smaller community? I gave you one example before, this electronic structure, because I kind of understand there's something about I guess I don't know enough about the mission approach, or is there some approach there where the church does not own the building? I mean, we're not in a position to say we have this $1 million entity, we'll donate it to the church so we can have mass there if the church wants to, but then they will keep it for the rest of the world. I mean, that's not a possibility. Yeah. So I'm looking, is there some practical, realistic way that we can incorporate maintaining a small community within the confines, within the restrictions of canon law?
So what we've done during the pandemic is we've had a lot of parish mergers over the last year and a half. And that is, so you say you have 2 or 3 parishes and you bring them together to be one new parish, and those 2 or 3 parishes either have 2 churches or 3 churches. So if the idea of merging, there's many reasons to do it, but one of them is to say, let's take a parish that doesn't have a lot of money and put them with someone who does, who might be able to afford that church building. They may have savings or they may have an offertory, a weekly offertory that could cover their own the church that they currently usually and the one that's now part of the merged parish. So that's one option. You could rent space. The reason that you might not want to have a separate community is because of other resources like priests. So you have a priest who can reach 400 people in a bigger church, and you may not have a priest that you can free up to celebrate Mass for 20 people. So it's just a matter of logistics at times.
Could you just address the rent point? Just how would that work? I thought that was not a possibility.
We have plenty of places where, not plenty, but there are places where, you know, you don't own the building that you're worshiping in. Trying to think of an example. I can say for myself, I mean, this is part of the parish property, but when I was a kid, we couldn't fit in my hometown, New York, we couldn't fit in our little small stone church. So in the 1980s, they decided to build a bigger church. So in the meantime, they couldn't fit everybody, so we worshiped in the gym. And that went on for years until they built the church. So there are things you can do, but in terms of a parish with finances and things like that, it becomes more difficult as a solution to dedicate one priest, and then where does his salary come from, things like that.
Your questions are to varieties, and I'm not criticizing the questioners, but they're either so wide open and open-ended that in essence they're difficult to be able to respond to say this is it. And the second type is that basically it relates to some of the stuff that we hear and see on the news, and we're just sort of curious about, you know, is there an inside answer to some of this? Is there something that affects our personal lives just directly, whether individually or whatever, that we could get to if that's still something of concern to you? Something individually that you think in terms of your own faith, the things you have to do, the things you have to experience. I realize that a lot of it may involve parishes because that's where our life actually centers. But outside of that, is there something in there that you'd like to be able to bring to the floor that deals more with the personal kind of things that where the church, what you like to know where the church stands?
I'm from Chicago, and at our church, which is not a parish, but is classified as a mission, but underneath the diocesan umbrella, one of the Sunday masses typically has 40 to 70 mass intentions. And when I grew up, one priest was able to hold one mass for one intention. So my question is, are all of those multiple mass intentions legitimate? And a related question, sometimes like the Smith family, the Jones family, and the Brown family will all have a mass for Johnson.
The deceased.
Yeah, for Johnson. So at one mass, there 3 times the deceased Johnson is having mass held for him. So is that all proper?
So the general rule is one intention per mass, but that one intention can be, so say I go to a pastor and I say, I want this intention to be for my mother's family, the Ryder family, and my father's family, the Peterson family, all the deceased of those families. That's one intention, because it's me asking. The Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith also in the 1990s issued a document that says you can, I'm trying to think of the word they use, basically combine mass intentions twice a week, but everybody has to be on board with that. So they all have to consent. So there's a lot of like Spanish-speaking parishes where everybody just knows that they're just throwing their intention in, and that's going to be like the combined intention, so it's known. And that's fine, but you only do that twice a week. There's other times where, say, someone has an intention for that mass, and someone comes to the pastor and says, oh, can you include my intention for today? It's the anniversary of the death of my mother. The pastor can't do that unless he receives the consent of the person who already had that intention.
Is that clear? Well, it's a depends kind of a thing, but on the other hand, the consent issue is one that I haven't heard.
Well, consent was very clear, but our situation is very muddy.
Yes, that's the way it is. Tommy, is it a long one?
We'll find out. Probably forget it by the time you get the microphone in hand. You mentioned earlier that, for example, in cases of sexual abuse, canon law, or the church waits for the case to be resolved in civil court. How do you deal with the issue globally, where mores in civil courts can be very, very different in different parts of the world? Is that principle still applied universally?
No, this is basically our choice. I think probably in other places, you probably could do things concurrently because in fact, some of the civil authorities may even appreciate the help of the investigations in the church if they don't have the resources. So I don't think you can have one rule in this case that applies to all. We know that we could be seen as interfering and be sued for it. Or an attorney general investigation into the archdiocese, that interfered with a state investigation or something like that. So we're very cautious.
Gotcha.
Another question from the wonderful Wind City.
Nothing to do with Chicago per se. The road to sainthood, is that canon law leading it? The way we have a number of people on the way on the road to sainthood among Lithuanian saints, or hopefully future saints. And by the time it gets to Rome, then it goes into the legal system. So is that canon law, or what?
No, that's a very good question. One of the things I forgot to mention that a tribunal does. So the tribunal does the investigation into the cause of saints. So in Boston, one of the miracles happened in Boston for John Henry Newman. And so it was a permanent deacon of the archdiocese who was claiming the miracle, and the doctors were backing him up. So the tribunal investigated that miracle, and then they made a recommendation to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. So it is very much controlled by canon law, and there's a very specific law on it, but just not necessarily in the code of canon law. So there's all sources of canon law that we probably don't even realize. Those liturgical books that the priests pray from, that's law. They're supposed to follow what it says in there. They're not supposed to deviate from there. If there are options in the book, they can take one of the options. But liturgical law is law. So liturgy books, all those things that are approved by the Holy See, prayer books, all those things. I'm trying to think of other examples of law, but the Pope issues motu proprios and apostolic constitutions, those are laws. So even if it's not in the code of canon law, it may still be a canon law.
Okay, have we exhausted our questions? Liturgical things that happen within the Mass, let's say, for example, you stand for some things, you sit for others, you kneel for others, or kneel if you can. Is there an effort to simplify some of that, so that up and down kind of thing, which basically annoys some people, and in essence, it never becomes sort of more automatic? Is that been any changes, either planned or that have already happened, to sort of minimize that? Some of it I realize is a question of respect. The Evangelium is read, the good news is being read, I understand that. But there are some of the issues that perhaps could benefit from a posture that could be more meaningful to the faithful, and less so when you interrupt your following Mass by having to do a certain physical action. That's not really a question of the law, but I'm wondering just your own feelings about that don't represent the Archdiocese.
So a lot of those things are determined on a national basis and based on national custom. So if you go to Europe, I don't know if you've been to Rome, you'll notice that a lot of those churches don't have kneelers. As a matter of fact, they have movable pews. But in Germany, they have kneelers. In the United States, they have kneelers. So there's this thing called the General Instruction on the Roman Missal. So you have the Roman Missal that is for the Universal Church, and then you have the General Instruction that is determined on a more local basis, and that determines all the ups and downs and the kneeling and the standing.
Give it a couple of seconds of thought to see if there's anything else, because you might not see a canonist for quite a long time, perhaps.
You may not want to.
Is it on the same topic?
No.
Something new.
Something new.
And short?
Very short. Okay.
We have a collaboration here. He's actually a plan.
No microphone this time. Now, does every bishop have his own canon advisor?
Every bishop should have his own canon advisor. Honestly, my take, and Pope Benedict mentioned it as one of his addresses, it's when we fail to look at our law, I think we make mistakes. During the sex abuse crisis, for 4 or 5 decades, you had bishops who looked at the issue of sex abuse as sin, a psychological issue. They never addressed it as a violation of the law. And had they done that, they would have addressed the issue much sooner. So too often you have bishops who don't get canon law advice or don't seek it out, or seek it from someone who's not trained in it, and I think you run into messes, to be honest. There's a lot of the dioceses don't have someone like me whose full-time job is to, revise the Vicar General with Archbishop, but a lot of them do. They have more and more dioceses are having lay chancellors, and they're studying, more and more lay people are studying canon law. And so you go throughout the country, and especially in the smaller dioceses, the chancellor is a layperson, and they fulfill the function that I fulfill, even though I'm a vice chancellor, which is advising the bishop on canon law and dealing with canon law marriage questions, dealing with paperwork, and basically serving as the archivist as well as serving as the canon law advisor.
So in a private company, if I'm making a decision and I don't consult the attorney, I'll be in probably not super if that calls me to be a problem. Is it the same thing for the bishop?
There are times when the bishops, when they fail to advise or give bad advice, where some acts will be negated. So we had a sale, take the diocese of Guam, the Archdiocese of Batania Heights in Guam. The bishop had a piece of property. It was a former hotel, beautiful piece of property right on the water, and he sold it to the Neo-Catechumenal Way for $1. And luckily, this is an entity within the church. It can be handled within the church. Had it been someone else, it would have been messier. People in the diocese sued, and they took it to the Holy See, and the Holy See overturned that transaction because he did not consult his finance council or his college of consultors. Does anybody know what the college of consultors is? No. So there's each diocese has a presbyteral council, and that's an advisory group of priests that some are appointed and some are elected to the bishop of the diocese. From that number, 12 make up the College of Consultors, and they have certain authority to act, say, when a bishop either dies. So you ever seen the installation of a bishop? They have the decree from the Holy See naming the new bishop. They show that to the College of Consultors, and that's usually, in Boston, it's the auxiliary bishops and some of the more seasoned priests. So that was one situation where the transaction was overturned because the bishop either didn't ask for canon law advice or didn't give advice. So it does happen.
A lot of thought to that last question, isn't it? Please.
Is it possible for a lay person to access, let's say for their own curiosity, positions of the canon law on certain subject or topics? Is it available? Is this something, or is it strictly controlled by people like you, like experts or advisors?
You mean like, can you access information about it?
Yeah, like if I'm interested, like what's the canon law on this and this subject? Is this something I would be able to access?
Absolutely. There's all kinds of resources online. There's a fairly young priest who was a year ahead of me in canon law. He's something of a canon law nerd. I mean, it was like occupied every moment of his day. And so he has a website called www.jgray.org. Monsignor Gray out of Peoria, Illinois. He's their Vicar General now. But he has all kinds of resources on there. He's got the codes of canon law in English and in Latin. So there's the Latin code, which is what I have right here, and then there's the Eastern code of canons. So again, there's canon law has many. I don't know if anybody knows, there's 21 Eastern churches, so different rites within the Catholic Church. They all report to the Pope, they all are under the Pope. So you have your Melkites, you have your Maronites, and your Chaldeans, and your Syro-Malabar, Syro-Malankar. There's 21 of them, and they're all within the fold of the Catholic Church. They have their own code, and then they have their own particular law within their own right. So there's plenty of resources out there if you're interested. There's history of canon law on some places, and there's articles on certain topics. There's journals where canon law experts write on a certain topic, like Parish Closings or something to that effect.
Thank you very much. He didn't hesitate for a moment when I asked him to come